Coronavirus outbreaks all over the world. The fire line has been breached. Italy turns to armed police and the military to enforce a strict quarantine. Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Martinson. This is your coronavirus update for February 23rd, 2020. I'm titling this one Fast and Furious. The data is coming in so quickly now, it's hard to keep up with all of it. But first, the numbers. China, who knows? Maybe this is correct. Maybe it isn't. Still reporting these sorts of numbers. I think the shape of the reporting is correct. I think that their actual efforts at containing the coronavirus very draconian. People are reportedly being locked in, welded into homes. Some of them are reporting being starving. We've got some other data on just how tough that is there today to discuss. But I think that's what it takes to really quarantine and get your R0 for this particular illness, this virus, down low enough to a level where you can start to see fewer and fewer cases, which we're seeing there. The Diamond Princess, the disaster princess, it just keeps delivering, and unfortunately it's now delivering deaths. That's about right in this stage of the disease progression. That's what we would expect to be seeing here. Serious critical still way ahead of total recovered, but we're going to have to talk about what recovered means in this context. South Korea, well on its way to doubling again. Deaths are starting to mount. I think that outside of China, we are going to begin seeing actual data that tells us a lot more about the true rate of infectivity of this particular virus, as well as its serious case complication, as well as the death rate. All of that, I think, is going to be tracked much more aggressively and well at this point in time. Italy, though, is coming on really strong. A lot to talk about in Italy. We'll get to that in just a second. Also recording a death here. And another death, so bringing its total to 3. Lots of people in serious and critical condition here, and we're going to talk about that in a second as well. Japan, still working on its outbreak. It's got an endemic epidemic ongoing right now. So anybody with over 100 cases, I think, is pretty well on that path. Iran, I'm convinced, is actually got a lot more cases than this. Maybe they can't test properly. Maybe they don't want to release it for political reasons. Who knows? But this 14 new cases, absolutely not consistent with these 8 deaths total, or these 2 deaths, 8 deaths total. So when you look at the overall ratio of deaths to the number of people reported to the fact that they're not reporting anybody over here in either of these 2 columns, tells you that they've got a lot more going on than they are admitting to. Thailand, I just don't believe this number at all. USA, I don't believe this number at all. Taiwan, yep, I think Taiwan's doing a pretty good job around this, but Vietnam, not a chance. Remember, I was over a week ago. They had 6 cases and they quarantined a fairly low rent district, if not a slum area, very, very, poorer district that had 10,000 people in it. And they put a quarantine around that and have reported no new cases since. Everybody's recovered and nobody in serious condition. I don't believe those numbers at all. So we're just going to have to watch that carefully. And of course, if you have an epidemic spreading and you're doing nothing to contain it, you're not taking the extraordinary and beautiful efforts that Singapore is taking. Hong Kong is making really excellent progress as well. I think Taiwan is. There are a lot of countries that are doing this well and some that are not. And those that, for whatever reasons, political or whatever they happen to be, that are not either testing or reporting on cases accurately, are really doing their populations a big disservice. So just taking the numbers as they are, though, I want to point something out to you. Total deaths, 2,444. Total cases, I don't believe either of these 2 numbers. But if we took them at face value, it would suggest that if we divided this number by this number, we would get a 3.1% case fatality rate. Now we're going to start figuring out what that true case fatality rate is as we look at these other cases as they come in. But again, it takes time for these to develop. So if you have a bunch of cases that have just shown up, like Italy, you need 7 to 14 days after that to find out if you're going to end up with people falling into this category over here. The fact that Italy has so many over here tells me that they've got way more than this number lurking around, that this has been cooking for a while, because I believe these people would have been infected, been asymptomatic for 5 to up to 27 days, and then another 7 days after they went symptomatic before they probably would have landed in this column. Again, average numbers, but this number is way too big for that number. One of these isn't correct. I'm believing this one because they're in a hospital hooked up to tubes and things. And again, Iran, we're just going to have to see what's going on there really quick. So This is from yesterday. Today's February 23rd. Health officials worry as untraceable virus clusters emerge. And this is where, when I said the fire line has been breached, remember when the Australian fires, you put out a fire line and you can hold it, but as that fire starts raging towards the fire line, eventually too many sparks jump that fire line and they start their own fires, and then you've no longer contained that fire. I think that's what we're seeing with all these hot spots that have come up and started to emerge. So this is from that article that we just looked at here, this one, reading on into this. So some good information here. In South Korea, Singapore, and Iran, clusters of infections are leading to a jump in cases of the total illness outside of China. But it's not the numbers that are worrying the experts. It's that increasingly they can't trace where the clusters started. And that's really all important if you're going to try and contain a particular illness. You've got to know who's patient zero or who's typhoid Mary in this story, or where did it come from, because you have to chase and trace that all the way back so that you can take everybody who was exposed or potentially exposed and set them to the side. And that's, if you don't know where the clusters are started, that's very worrying from an epidemiological public health standpoint. And but as hotspots emerge around the globe, trouble finding each new source, the first patient who sparks every new cluster, that might signal the disease has begun spreading too widely for tried and true public health steps to stamp it out. Well, if you don't have your tried and true public health steps, there aren't really that many afterwards that you can then turn to. So, what are we looking at here? The number of spot fires occurring around the world is a sign that things are ticking along. Absolutely true. And that what we're going to have here is probably a pandemic. Well, I think we probably already have one by most definitions. But it's really going to hit a point where it hits that public consciousness. Remember, all truth passing through three stages. First, it's ridiculed, then it's violently opposed, and then it's accepted as self-evident. We're getting to that self-evident stage. They've already gotten there in Italy, and I'll show you some pictures about what that means in just a second. However, as of yesterday, that worst case isn't here yet. The WHO insists it isn't convinced that countries outside China need more draconian measures. But it pointed to spikes in cases in Iran and South Korea to warn that time may be running out to contain the virus. Again, pleasing, happy words from the WHO, who've absolutely dropped the ball in this entire thing. So glad that Google has decided that the WHO is the organization that you most want to follow. You probably can look right below the bottom of this particular video and see that Google has very helpfully put a whole WHO thing down there. So you can go to the WHO and get information like this. Just not helpful at all. Let's go to Italy, though. This is really important to see because of just how fast this can break. Why? I keep talking about how important it is for everyone, for you to be prepared. Because there's a time to prepare, and then there's a time when preparing no longer is possible, and that can come faster than you expect. I'm sure that the people in Italy, as spring starts to approach, this is the last thing on their minds, and all of a sudden, boom, they're hit with a big outbreak that just raged through the Milan region. 38 new cases in Italy, 36 in Lombardy, including a 17-year-old male. Hey, that's kind of young, right? Including 2 in Turin, a couple who visited their child at the hospital in Turin yesterday morning, so they got it right in the hospital. Look at this, though. Armed forces and police forces have been mobilized to form an insurmountable health belt around contagion areas. Roadblock violators risk up to a 3 months prison sentence. And this is what it looks like down here right now. Let me just see if I can expand this out so you can see this just a little better. People driving along are running into men with guards and policemen with stop signs and submachine guns at the ready. So they're pretty seriously going to enforce a roadblock here. I don't see spike strips on the road or anything like that, but if you drove up to this, you'd probably do well to stop. And these are people, I assume they're facing in, so people would be trying to maybe leave this area, and they would be getting turned back. Not sure what this person in the bicycle back here is going to do when they get there. All right, beyond that, the serious mistake they noted was, and this is from the Italian, on the Italian situation, serious mistake was made not to quarantine people who arrived in Italy from China, said Walter Ricciardi of the WHO. So there's the WHO saying, yeah, might have, a WHO official, but certainly not the top WHO officials, saying, yeah, we might have made a mistake not quarantining people coming in from China. Yep, that was the mistake, and that's why we were calling for a travel ban a long time ago. At a minimum, adding a really fat quarantine time on there, more than 2 weeks. Why? Because this thing may have an incubation period, a silent incubation of up to 27 days. So maybe let's bust out the old meaning of quarantine, 40 days quarantine. Within 2 weeks, we will know if we are facing an epidemic. I think you might know earlier than that. Advising that for the next 2 weeks, people should avoid crowded places, metro, buses, trains, schools, discos. Yep, avoid that for sure. Gyms. Schools are now closed in Milan for a week. 26 patients in critical condition. 11 towns, 50,000 people in lockdown. And let's talk about this because these 23 cases talked about, the 155 talked about it. There was a death in Italy as an elderly woman who, in addition to coronavirus, is also suffering from cancer. So that comorbidity, very much not helpful in this particular virus outbreak. Absolutely. Italy's Lombardy region, which includes the city of Milan, bans public events to stop the spread of coronavirus. So this would be the Lombardy region here. And that includes this major city of Milan. And right down here is, or somewhere right in here is where that first city that the case came from that we talked about yesterday with that 38-year-old and his sports partner, whatever that means. But it started right here and now it's spread to a variety of cities all through here. So this whole region has just been placed into a voluntary lockdown with a military quarantine around these towns down here. We always tell you to prepare early and prepare often. These are scenes from some guy saying, my local supermarket, south of Milan, panic stocking up on food because of coronavirus. So emptying shelves, empty spots in the shelves. I guess nobody wants to buy these things, but they will if it goes on far enough. Here's another picture of a meat aisle or some other fresh aisle that requiring refrigeration, supermarket in Milan. So there is preparing before the crisis comes, which I think is responsible, as long as you don't overdo it and don't slip over into hoarding. But once you're stuck into this, you're just competing with people for limited resources. You should never be part of this. You're a thoughtful person. The reason you're watching this is you're part of the curious crowd who can manage to absorb information like this, think for yourself, and make your own decisions. And of course, those are the people I'm most like speaking to. South Korea, remember yesterday we talked about how they were having 1 day doubling times in their cases here. Will they make it today? Well, the day is still in progress. I pulled this off at about 3:30 in the afternoon Eastern time. They were at 602 cases. So maybe as long as they get to 860 cases, they're looking at a 1 day doubling time. Now, South Korea may not be as bad as it looks because out of all of these new cases that are confirmed yesterday, Saturday, of that total, 231 were linked to this one church with Typhoid Mary, that superior spreader from that city of Daegu, and 111, including 4 nurses, were from a psychiatric ward of the hospital in Cheongdo County. So those two clusters account for almost 80% of the confirmed cases. So it really raged in here. And of course, I think South Korea is going to do a really good job of managing that because South Korea's got just an absolutely great response to this. I think their government is doing a good job. Here's one example of that. This is what I think a responsive government looks like. In South Korea, emergency alerts about coronavirus cases nearby. You get a text, and it tells you where the person with the virus has been and at what time, and it's incredibly detailed. So you can imagine you're walking along, and ding, you get a text because you're in proximity to where somebody had the virus and at what time that was relevant. That is really important, relevant information. You're trying to track an invisible thing for your health authorities to be giving you that emergency alert. I think super useful. So I think that's what a responsive government looks like. In Japan, 8 people, there are a bunch of new cases, but let's talk about these 8 people in Hokkaido, confirmed infection. This is kind of interesting because of these 8 new cases that were confirmed to have been infected with the new coronavirus, 26 people now confirmed infected there. Of these was a female student in her 20s and is now on a ventilator and is in serious condition. So just being young isn't a guarantee that you're going to be okay in this particular story. So that's kind of interesting to track. Listen, everything is really just rapidly evolving right now. I think things are much worse in Iran than advertised, and I told you why, and I suspected before. Here's why. Afghanistan closes border with Iran due to coronavirus. I mean, they looked over the border. They've got good information. They see a neighbor, and they're like, that's it. We're just going to close our border. Turkey closes a border with Iran. Okay? Pakistan closes a border with Iran. They're just not messing around here. Armenia closes a border with Iran. So this is much more than 28 cases in Iran and 8 deaths at this point in time. Something much bigger is happening. I'm going to go with these border closings, which is a serious deal. When you do a border closing, that something big is going on. The European CDC equivalent, or CDC, on the coronavirus says, as the situation is rapidly evolving, more cases are expected in Italy, possibly in the EU, in coming days. Now, we finally have some good news here too. Singapore, which I tell you, they've just been doing a fabulous job. Remember, we went over there, that chart that showed all the information they were giving people. They've just been done a bang-up job of being highly transparent, super communicative, giving people good, timely information. Well, they're reporting no new cases of coronavirus today, and that last time that happened was on February 3rd, so they may have hunted down and gotten all of the clusters that they needed to go after. So that is a pretty good thing. All right. Let's see. Where are we going from there? Oh, this is coming out more and more. We talked about this yesterday, but we've got a lot of new news on this now. February 23rd, coronavirus to Wuhan to quarantine all cured patients for 14 additional days after some test positive again. So recovered and discharged people were sent to designated centers from Saturday onwards because they retested them and discovered that they were still infectious and infected and able to pass that along. Even though their symptoms had abated, their body was busy fighting the illness enough so that they weren't suffering from the illness anymore, they still had viral loads that were highly detected. Now, I don't know if people are still infective at that point in time. They certainly have a viral load that's detectable, but I don't know if those viruses are all coated with antibodies and they are therefore no longer infective. They may have been deactivated by these people's systems, but can't run the test for that. Nobody, I think, is pulling the viruses out of these people and seeing if they're still infective. They're just saying, we put these into our PCR tests. We can detect viruses, and so that might be what's happening here. So, but at any rate, it's certainly something that has to be considered because, of course, remember, you can be recovered but still infectious, right? So this may be the case with the coronavirus. I don't know, but we know it's true for norovirus. We know that there's time after you are no longer symptomatic in the red before you are not contagious anymore. So you can still spread this 1 to 3 weeks after you're all better, seeming rotavirus. Same thing, 1 to 3 weeks after you feel all better and your symptoms have passed. Same for influenza, rhinovirus. So maybe coronavirus is no different. And that brings us back to this. So I think this is why Wuhan has discovered those viral loads, and it's probably safest to just continue to quarantine people. But imagine this now. You've gone in, you've spent 1 to 3 weeks in the ICU bed to get past a very, very dangerous pneumonia. And then the next thing you have to do is spend 2 more weeks in quarantine. So this is a month and a half out of work, out of life, away from your family, in hospitals. It's just an extraordinarily disruptive thing. And the load on the system to care for all of these people as well, just enormous. All right. I think we're almost to that self-evident stage. Front page, Bloomberg, top of the fold. Here it is. I guess it's okay to talk about this now. Global fear spreads as cases surge in Italy, South Korea. They got a big virus update here. I don't know why we have to go straight to fear. You know, there's a big territory again between being ignorant and totally unaware and not talking about something and being in complete panicky fear. There's a lot of territory in there. The media likes to pretend like you're either totally ignorant or you're out here in global fear. And so I think global concern really ought to be spreading, but that would be prudent. That would be reasonable given the information we have. So Italy, virus cases jump even after a lockdown in North. I got an article about that. They closed the door at the Armani fashion show. And the wait for China to shake off virus nears key moment. I don't think you shake this one off. And yesterday I talked about the impact I think this is going to have. I think most people are not going to get this thing on the first pass round. We'll have to see what the fall brings. But most people are going to be more people than 50% in this world are going to be impacted by the economic and supply chain disruptions. So yesterday I was just guessing, and I said, I wouldn't be surprised to find out if China has 30 or maybe even 33% of global manufacturing. Hunted it down. Nope, close. It has 28.4% of share of global manufacturing output in 2018. It's just enormous. And Japan is also on its way to getting shut down soon. South Korea as well. Italy as well. And it'd be very surprising if we didn't see this spreading to these other places before too much time passes on. This is a few days old. This chart came out a while ago, but the coronavirus is already expected to impact tech industry shipments in the first quarter of 2020, which ends January, February, March. That's the first quarter. So by the end of March, they're expecting to see, I think the world can live with a few fewer smartwatches. No big deal. But all of these electronic things are going to get hit pretty hard. I'm going to bet as this chart gets updated, it's going to be a little bit higher than that. But at least we got an early read on it. One does not simply cut out basically 30% of your global manufacturing all at once without creating just an enormous, enormous supply chain shock. And who knows how that ripples through the larger system. We have these unpredictable supply chain hits. There's the first order hit, of course. Hey, this factory is no longer producing one of the 30,000 components that goes into a car. So we can't make that car till we second source that component. But we're going to wait for that factory to get back up online. But that factory, the second order impact is it might be relying on 4 other downstream factories for earlier component parts to manufacture its part. And once you factor all that in, it's very unpredictable how this is going to hit all these supply chains. But if you look at who's over here with share of all imports of intermediate products coming from China, who's over the 35% mark, or, the 35% mark here, that would be the United States, clearly Japan, South Korea right there, Vietnam. I'm not sure, maybe Chile's in on that too. But everybody else is somewhere, well over this mark. All the industrial manufacturing centers are, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30% of their intermediate products come from China. That's a really big deal. So, I guess it is okay to talk about this now because here's some more stuff out of Bloomberg. Millions of Chinese firms face collapse if banks don't act fast. So that's a really, really big deal. And I got a chart from Bloomberg next to show you. But before we skip past this, China is likely to see a V-shaped recovery. People's Bank of China deputy says, good luck with that. Bankers, especially central bankers, they always like those V-shaped recoveries. They're always looking for the V-shaped recovery. Good luck with that. Might be more of an L-shaped recovery. So, and it's fun when they talk about interrupting supply chains. They always tell stories about things that really doesn't matter. A few extra watches don't get shipped. Lobsters don't get shipped, but they really aren't talking about the things that really actually matter. I care more about the pharmaceuticals in this story and mission critical electronic components that go into, say, the grid, things like that. Those would be lobsters. Put the lobsters back in the ocean. That feels good. All right. Hard questions that we have to ask. Who's going to give this money to the firm? So this is from this earlier article talking about millions of Chinese firms facing collapse, showing that small and medium-sized firms say they're going to run out of cash. It's like a third of them are going to report running out of cash in just 1 month. And this comes from a survey in February 14th, so we're already a week into that. So let's say 3 weeks left on that third. Another, call it a third, runs out of cash in 2 months. Basically, all but 10% are going to run out within 5 months here, okay? So that's a really big deal. Millions of firms. So who's going to shovel all the cash to them under what terms? Or is the central bank just going to print money in China and just throw it at these firms and hope for the best? How would they distribute it? Who gets it? So many unanswered questions. But I have a similar question, and even more than that, how to get money to hundreds of millions of people and families. Because now we have other hard questions. How are you going to get that money to families? Jennifer Zheng reporting here that a couple was forced to abandon baby as no money left, no income during coronavirus outbreak. They already became homeless. They hope the orphanage can take baby and promise will come get back him in 1 month if they survive. So This is just a small metaphor of what's probably happening to all those families who are locked down, who are not going to work, who were getting a paycheck from those millions of firms who are very close to the edge. How would you even begin to print money so that you could distribute it across equitably, if that's even a concern in this case, to all these millions and millions of families? It's just unclear what that mechanism would be, but maybe it's possible in a place like China with its command and control economy and its communist leadership structure and all of that. But what's going to happen in the United States, where half the families basically have no money in the bank? What happens to if schools close and single moms can't both go to work and take care of their kids who are suddenly home? What happens when the paychecks stop running? What happens if you spend 3 weeks in the ICU? These are huge, huge questions that I believe are going to lead to just a massive amount of money printing, but also a lot of disruption before the kinks in that system even get remotely resolved. We're going to really regret not having prepared for this pandemic in advance. And so I really take exception to the WHO organization at the top trying to downplay this, because it's not something that should be downplayed. This is not the flu. It's not SARS. I've gone over this a bunch, but maybe very quickly it's worth talking about it again. We have this really serious complication rate. At least 15% of people who get it end up with pneumonia. Up to 5% of those require intensive care. It's just a very complicated and complex treatment once you have this intensive care requirement. It's a lot more deadly than the flu, 20x approximately. And, of course, unless your hospital's overrun, then maybe 50x, because people who could have been saved, should have been saved, no longer can receive the appropriate care because you're out of medicine, you're out of staff, you're out of bed, something. And so it becomes really quite deadly. Untreated pneumonia, of course, is a very, very deadly thing. Super high R naught, way over 3, maybe as high as 6.7. But the doubling times we're seeing right now in South Korea, and what I suspect is happening in Iran, and what we just saw happen in Italy, really support this high end of this R naught calculation right here. And a doubling time that's basically every day supports a R naught much higher than even this. This gives you one that's around every 2.4 days. We know that this spreads asymptomatically. Geez, that's just really bad. We know that it spreads via droplets and aerosols at this point in time. It means you have to have the eye protection as part of this, and it's very difficult to avoid aerosols. Has a long incubation period, but maybe super long, up to 24 days. We were saying maybe 27 days. A couple of cases like this. This isn't going to be everybody, but it's going to look as shaped like this, big long tail. But there are people out here on this end of the tail who are going to be infective through this ridiculously long incubation period. I would think most of them are probably right in here in the 5 to 7 day zone. There's no natural immunity in the human herd, so there's no fire breaks. There's no community it runs into where a lot of people have the antibodies and the virus just peters out because it's got nowhere to land. It's just seeds being cast on concrete. There's nothing for those seeds to do. No vaccine is available. A lot of people ask me all the time, what about these vaccines that people are developing right now? Hey, we don't have one yet, and we don't have prior vaccines to work from, which is critical. And we know that from prior SARS vaccine attempts that those made things worse, not better. They were worse than nothing. They actually created a secondary infection presentation that was fatal for the animal models that they were studying it in. Smoking, we don't know. Make it worse? Maybe. We don't know. Is the second exposure far worse? We don't know. We're getting some data now that there are people showing up again with secondary infections, but we don't have any data on how bad that is or if it's more, mild or less mild or any of that stuff. We know that the testing, such as it is, often results in false negatives. In the United States case, that was because we were sending out test kits. The CDC was sending out test kits with bad reagents in them. Oops, try again. So even under the best of circumstances, though, you are going to get false negatives just because that's how it works. Kids are spared, thankfully, especially the younger they are. Infants under the age of 1 year, very, very resistant to this. Great. And that men are affected more than women. None of that's like the flu, all very, very different, and not like SARS, especially these parts down here. Okay, conclusions for today. Japan and Korea now have the coronavirus endemic. That means it's resident in their populations and spreading freely amongst their people to their countries, and it's well on their way to being a full-blown epidemic. Iran, I think they're probably there too. Italy, certainly well on its way. They have sustained human-to-human transmission, but we need to start seeing cases here in Italy showing up where they can't chase or trace the contacts. As soon as you have those, then you're endemic. If you can't figure out where it came from, I think Italy, for the most part, can still chase and trace those contacts all the way back and figure out where this came from. But as soon as you get those, hey, we don't know where these people got it kind of cases, now it's endemic and it's running around. The Iranian death count, 8, plus the neighboring country reactions, all closing their borders, tells us that things are really much worse in Iran than they are letting on so far. I guess no surprise there, but that tells us as well that both Italy and Iran pierced my little bubble, which said, well, maybe this has, is sort of ethnically targeted in some way and affects Asian people and males maybe more than other culture, races or ethnicities. Well, the Iranian experience and the Italian experience both just say no to that theory. It looks like it's game on in a lot of places. These supply chain disruptions, though, and the impacts of those on shadow banking, which is a fancy lending, high leverage lending sort of world of shadowy world of banks lending to hedge funds, to private equity people. They're betting on cross-pair trades, and running arbitrage strategies and doing all this crazy stuff that you need basically a full PhD in finance to even understand what the heck's going on. That shadow banking really depends on everything working, and it protects itself, and I use that term loosely, with these things called derivatives, which are a form of financial insurance that work until you need it. And then I think it just doesn't work. We don't know how these supply chain disruptions are going to smash into all that. My bet is pretty badly. Some things you just can't print your way out of, and I think this is going to hurt. It's my opinion, but I think it's going to hurt. My other opinion on this is that people in general in the West have placed entirely too much faith in the power of central banking to correct all things by printing. And they're going to print, trust me, and they're going to print a lot, but you can't undo a supply chain malfunction just by throwing a bunch more money into the marketplace. You can make stocks go a little higher. That can make things look a little better. But what really needs to be happening, what our authorities really need to be doing, rather than just trying to print money so that, the stock price of Boeing goes up for a couple more days so people feel good. They need to be directing that money towards proper preparations, helping people get ready. I would support seeing money being wired directly into the bank accounts of ordinary people, right? Just figure out the tax returns. Anybody who's earning more than a certain amount, you got nothing, you got plenty. Go figure out what you need to do. But for people who don't have, income above a certain level, give them some money and tell them to go spend it on some things that could really make a difference in their future, especially if they find themselves quarantined and they suddenly wake up one day and discover that this is what their life looks like. Because, that's just what the data tells us right now. Things could end up looking that way in a hurry if it comes to your neck of the woods. Let's hope it doesn't, but we have to prepare and plan as if it might. That's the prudent thing to do. Again, come by peakprosperity.com if you want to continue the conversation. We've got some extraordinary threads of material there being collated and gathered by D. Trammell. One of our members has done a just heroic job of assembling this information into some really big threads. And you can find things there around preparing, around what kind of things you might want to buy, about support that you can do for yourself, for your health and immune system, things like that. So peakprosperity.com, that's where we're having that larger conversation. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you tomorrow.
Hi, folks. Adam Taggart here. Chris Martinson and I are the co-founders of Peak Prosperity. If you want to get alerted whenever we release a new video from Chris, just click the red subscribe button right beneath the YouTube video player. Once you've done that, a little bell icon will appear right next to it. Click on that bell. It looks like this. And that's it. The next time we publish a video from Chris, you'll immediately receive a notification from YouTube. Thanks for watching our videos.